Hello and welcome to the second clip for the scene editor. In the previous clip we covered the functionality of the scene editor. In this clip we will cover now the function of the buttons beside the scene editor window. So if we start on the very top, we can see we have a camera section over here, so we can switch between the different cameras. We have seen this in the previous clip. But we also have the L button where we can go to the layer manager. So this allows you to use a front layer, a middle layer and a back layer. So you can load scenes accordingly into your layers and draw them all together as one scene. Then the next part would be the snapshot. So if I click on snap, I can choose if I want to create a screenshot. I call this a screenshot 1 and choose to switch it to capture it either in RGB or RGBA. I have my setting on auto key, so I can go to RGBA and snap that one. It should be replaced, and here we see we get the screenshot of the image. This is the RGB and that's the alpha. So creating screenshots is very commonly used to fake shadows. So very often you just go to your top view, you create the screenshot and you filter the image a little bit with the blur and make it to black and white, so you can use it as a fake shadow. Then underneath we have a button called PP. PP means post-processing effect. If I click on that one, we can see already we're getting a blur. So on my camera setting, I have a focal plane and I have a max blur. So if I crank up this value to 14, I have an even higher blur, and I can play now a little bit around with the focal plane. So with the focal plane, depending where I move it, I get more blur on the front or less blur on the front, and now a lot of blur on the background, or I can do it exactly the opposite, so I get more blur on the front and no blur on the background. So this is usually used for the depth of field. In the previous Viz versions, all these post-processing effects were only visible on the video output, which was pretty hard for a designer. So in the new version, we have the post-processing effects available on the VGA editor, and every designer can directly see either the camera transformation or the post-processing effect like the blurs or some glows and stuff like that. The next button we have is KP, that means keyed preview. So inside this, in the scene settings, you can define a background image but also a foreground image. But that's not enough, because you can use a keyed preview or a preview image to see the keyed preview. Usually the keyed preview is only visible if you are connected through a vision mixer, and then you get the final signal. But sometimes it's difficult for the designers to decide if the key is correct, if the fading of the key is fine. So for that reason you can activate a preview window, a preview texture, and if you go on to KP, you can see the keyed preview, but on the video output you will not see this image. This image is only drawn on the VGA. Then the next button we have is N. With the N we can show the normals. So if I click on bounding box, activate my element and go to N, I would see usually the normals of my object, and that shows me in which direction my normals are facing. So I can flip the face orientation and the normals are going inward. With this one the normals are going outwards. Let's change the angle and rebuild my object, and I get my object correctly back. And showing the normals on a 3D surface as an example looks then like this. So there's tons of normals inside this geometry, and we can just see the direction in which the face normals are showing. This is for the normals, the preview. Then let's go back to the logo and have a look on the next button. The next button is E for events. So if you have a script which is using some mouse events on mouse clicks or something like this, if you want to control the events, the scripts directly from inside the VGA, you have to activate E. But be careful, because if E is activated, you cannot really click any objects anymore. You can select the objects from the tree, but not by clicking directly through the scene editor. Then there is two more buttons, TA and SA. This is title area, save area. You can specify inside the scene settings and the rendering options the size for the title area and for the save area. So these are the default settings. Since we're having almost everybody at home a flat screen, save area and title area is not as important anymore as it was on the 4x3 regular screens. But you still can work with save and title areas. Then the next point is key. With the key, you just click on key and you can see the key signal inside the scene editor instead of having the RGB signal in here. I personally recommend using the key preview because this shows me combined the key, so I can adjust the key settings or at least define if my key is correct or not, instead of looking only onto the key or only onto the RGB. The W goes for wireframe, so here we see the wireframe resolution of the objects, not much to mention over here. Then BB is the bounding box, and the next part is P for performance. The performance bar, if you click on this one, will show us how much performance we have. But this is something you need to be careful, because if you have the stage open, the performance bar is calculated in a different way because the stage is an OpenGL window, and this takes influence onto the performance bar. In general, when you want to measure the performance, you should always go into on-air mode and check the performance from in here. So if you cannot see the performance now on my VGA preview, you just click the control button and your right mouse button and activate performance. And if I go now into the on-air mode and have a look here, I see now the correct performance bar with the current frame rate and the maximum frame rate. But the performance bar can show more than just the current and the maximum frame rate. The performance bar can give you a lot of detailed information. If you click with your middle mouse button onto your performance bar, you get a way more detailed information for the deinterlacing, for the mip mapping, for the vertices, for the texture current, for the texture in the scene, for the animation, the metrics, the C-sort and culling, the video download, the rendering, the plugin rendering time, the scripting calculation time, and the current and the max frame rate. You find a detailed explanation in the user manual of this on page 243, and here you can read about the details of the complex performance bar. And last but not least, we have the grid. The grid is a very nice and neat function that can help you a lot. So let me deactivate one of the objects, enable my grid, and now we can choose either to a XY plane type, to a XZ plane type, or to a YZ plane type. So I want to start with a free plane, and if I click on the free plane, you can see if I turn it off, we don't have these buttons over here. If I click on a XY plane, I'm not having these buttons available, but if I click now on the free grid, I can now adjust it by myself. So if I open the value editor, I can now rotate my grid on the two axes, and I can reposition my grid. And now it's pretty easy to use the object and drive the object just along the grid. Depending on the angle that you have set up, my object is following directly on the grid. Here we have now two more features. First of all, I can move the grid to the object. If I click on that one, the grid is moving directly to the object, which I don't want because we want to have this special rotated grid. But what I want is to jump with my object onto the grid. So here we have move object to plane. And if I click now on my Vizrt logo, if that one is activated, and I say, well, move it to plane, this is now correctly aligned to the plane, and it's following directly the grid into space. So what you can do is now to mix different or several grids together. So the first one is a free plane type of the grid, and this is on setup number 1. So I can now push the second button and create a new setup with an XY grid over here, take the object and say, well, I want to align the object on the grid and move it again on this grid. You can change the size of your grid, And you can make your grid also magnetic, so the object snaps to the grid. So when you do tables, create tables, or complex broadcast graphics, this sometimes is quite helpful to get objects faster or easier aligned on a certain screen position. So here we can switch now between the different grids that we have predefined. We can turn on and off the grids. We can go to the home position with the grid. In my case, I just want to have an undo. Oh, actually, that doesn't work for the grid. So let's rotate this one again and orient my object to the grid. So this is the functionality of the grid, and what you also can do is change the color of the grid depending on your background color. So it's up to you to choose in which color you want to see the grid. If we disable the grid, so I just turn it off with the eye and close the grid, the button gets orange, and that indicates I have active grids in the scene, but I'm just not drawing them. So this is up to you to choose again, okay, on which preset you want to go and which grid you want to draw inside your scene. If you don't want to have any grids, just turn the grids off and your button goes gray again. So that was the functionality of the buttons for the scene editor. Thanks for watching, and see you soon on the next video.